Have you ever wondered if love at first sight truly exists? Today's story will leave you breathless with its tale of impossible romance and heart-wrenching choices. Set in the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming in 1887, this is a story of Thomas Tom McKinnon, a humble shepherd boy who shared one magical night with the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. What he didn't know was that this mysterious lady from the eastbound train was Catherine Whitmore, wife of railroad tycoon Harrison Whitmore, who had mysteriously vanished 6 months earlier. When fate brings them together again, their forbidden love will be tested by secrets, society, and a truth that could destroy everything they hold dear. Before we dive into this epic tale of love that defies all odds, I need to ask you something important. YouTube has been quietly unsubscribing people from channels without warning, and many of our loyal viewers are missing these incredible stories. Could you please check if you're still subscribed? If that subscribe button isn't red, please hit it now. We bring you amazing historical romances like this every week, and you won't want to miss a single one. Trust me, Tom and Catherine's story will remind you that true love knows no boundaries of class or circumstance. Let's begin this unforgettable journey. The summer of 1887 had been particularly harsh in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming. The endless days of drought had turned the prairie grass golden brown, and the cattle were growing restless. 22-year-old Tom McKinnon stood on the ridge overlooking the small frontier town, watching his flock of sheep graze in whatever shade they could find near Willow Creek. Tom was what folks in town politely called a good, honest boy. The son of Irish immigrants who had died in a cholera outbreak when he was 16, he'd been making his living as a shepherd ever since, sleeping under stars more often than under a roof. His hands were calloused from honest work, his clothes were patched but clean, and his heart held dreams that seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. The afternoon train whistle echoed across the valley, and Tom looked up to see the black smoke of the Denver and Rio Grande locomotive pulling into the station. It was an event that still drew most of the town's 300 residents, even though the railroad had been coming through for nearly 2 years now. Today was different, though. It was a night of the Founders' Day celebration, and the whole town would be gathering in the square for music, dancing, and the closest thing to sophistication that Cedar Ridge could offer. Tom had been debating whether to attend. His best shirt was clean but obviously mended. His boots were worn thin, and he knew he'd stand out among the merchants, ranchers, and their families who made up the town's respectable society. But something made him decide to go. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been eating at him lately, or maybe it was just the pull of human companionship after weeks alone with the sheep. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that only the western frontier could produce, Tom made his way into town. The square was already alive with activity. Lanterns strung between the buildings, a makeshift stage where the Hartley brothers were tuning their fiddles, and tables laden with food that the town's women had spent all day preparing. Tom hung back at the edge of the crowd, feeling self-conscious but enjoying the music and laughter. That's when he saw her. She stood near the hotel, slightly apart from the crowd, and she was the most beautiful woman Tom had ever laid eyes on. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue silk that probably cost more than he made in 6 months, but it wasn't her fine clothes that caught his attention. It was the way she carried herself. Proud but not arrogant, elegant but somehow approachable. Her dark hair was arranged in the latest Eastern fashion, and her skin was pale in a way that spoke of a life lived indoors, away from the harsh western sun. But it was her eyes that truly captured him. Even from a distance, he could see they held a sadness that seemed at odds with the celebration around her. You planning to stare at her all night, or are you going to ask her to dance? Tom turned to find old Jake Morrison, the town's blacksmith, grinning at him with amusement. I couldn't, Tom stammered. Look at her, Jake. She's a lady of quality. What would someone like her want with a shepherd? Won't know unless you try. Boy. Besides, Jake lowered his voice, word is she came in on the afternoon train, traveling alone. Been standing there looking lonely as a lost calf for the better part of an hour. What do you think Tom should do? Should he approach this mysterious lady or stay safely in the shadows? Let me know in the comments, because what happens next will change both their lives forever. Tom watched as several of the town's more prosperous men approached the lady, offering introductions and invitations to dance. To each, She gave a polite but distant smile and a gentle refusal. There was something in her manner that suggested she was used to such attention, but found no joy in it. The music started up again, a waltz that seemed almost too sophisticated for Cedar Ridge, and Tom made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He walked across the square, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it over the music. As he approached, he could see her more clearly. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of refined beauty that belonged in the pages of the fashion magazines that sometimes made their way to the general store. But up close, that sadness in her eyes was even more apparent. "Excuse me, ma'am," Tom said, removing his worn hat and holding it against his chest. "I know I'm not much to look at, and I'm sure you have your pick of partners, but would you do me the honor of this dance?" She turned to look at him, and for a moment, Tom felt as though she was seeing right through to his soul. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when she smiled, really smiled for the first time that evening, it was like the sun breaking through. "I would be delighted," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of Eastern refinement. "I'm Catherine." "Tom," he replied, offering his arm. "Tom McKinnon." As they moved onto the makeshift dance floor, Tom was acutely aware of the eyes on them. He could hear the whispers. Who was this stranger, and what was she doing dancing with the shepherd boy? But the moment Catherine placed her hand in his, and he felt the warmth of her fingers through her silk gloves, the rest of the world disappeared. Tom had learned to dance from his mother before she died, and muscle memory guided him through the steps. But it was more than just dancing. It was as if they had been made to move together. Catherine followed his lead with a grace that made him feel, for the first time in his life, like a gentleman. "You dance beautifully," she said as they moved through the waltz. "Where did a shepherd learn such refined steps?" "My mother," Tom replied, surprised by his own boldness in continuing the conversation. "She said a man should know how to conduct himself in any company. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She lost her 6 years ago to the cholera, along with my father." Catherine's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. It must have been very difficult." There was something in her voice that suggested she understood loss herself. But before Tom could pursue the thought, the music ended. For a moment they stood there, still close enough that he could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that was as foreign to Cedar Ridge as snow in July. "Thank you," Catherine said. "That was lovely. Would you care to take a walk?" Tom asked, surprising himself with his boldness. "It's a beautiful night, and the moon's near full." Catherine hesitated, glancing back toward the hotel. For a moment, Tom thought she would refuse. Then she smiled again, and it was like a gift. "I would like that very much." They walked away from the crowd, toward the edge of town where the prairie stretched out under the star-filled sky. The music and laughter faded behind them, replaced by the gentle sounds of the night. Crickets chirping, the distant lowing of cattle, and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. For 2 hours, they talked about everything and nothing. Tom found himself telling her about his dreams. Maybe saving enough money to buy a small ranch. Maybe traveling east to see the cities his parents had told him about. Catherine spoke of books and music, of places she had traveled. But Tom noticed she never mentioned family or home in any detail. When they finally returned to the town square, the celebration was winding down. As they reached the hotel, Catherine turned to him. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, Tom. I can't remember when I've enjoyed myself more. Will I see you again?" Tom asked, knowing he was overstepping but unable to stop himself. Catherine's smile faltered for just a moment. "I'm leaving on tomorrow's eastbound train. But Tom," she reached out and touched his hand briefly. "Tonight was special. Please don't forget that." She disappeared into the hotel, leaving Tom standing alone under the stars, already missing her and knowing that his simple life had just become infinitely more complicated. He had no idea that the mysterious Catherine was already married, or that her husband was one of the most powerful men in the country. And he certainly had no idea that he would see her again under circumstances that would test everything he believed about love, honor, and the power of the human heart. Stay with us and make sure you're still subscribed. YouTube has been unsubscribing people automatically, because Chapter 2 reveals a shocking truth about Catherine's identity and the dangerous secret she's been hiding. 3 months had passed since that magical night in Cedar Ridge, but Tom McKinnon couldn't forget Catherine. He'd catch himself looking toward the train station whenever he heard the whistle, hoping against hope that she might return. He'd replayed their conversation 1,000 times, wondering what he could have said or done differently to make her stay. The autumn of 1887 brought early snows to the Wyoming Territory, and Tom was preparing to move his flock to lower pastures when his world turned upside down. He was in Jameson's general store, buying supplies for the winter, when he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. "Terrible business. That Whitmore situation," Mrs. Jameson was saying to the circuit judge, who had stopped in Cedar Ridge on his monthly rounds. "Such a beautiful young widow and so much money involved." "Indeed," Judge Crawford replied, examining a newspaper he brought from Denver. Harrison Whitmore was one of the wealthiest railroad men in the country. His disappearance last spring has left quite a mystery. They still haven't found his body. And his poor wife, Mrs. Jameson continued. "Catherine Whitmore, wasn't it? The papers say she's been traveling all over the West, looking for any clue about what happened to him." Tom's blood turned to ice. Catherine Whitmore, the woman he'd danced with, the woman he'd fallen in love with in the span of a single evening, was the wife of Harrison Whitmore, a name even a simple shepherd recognized as one of the most powerful industrialists in America. With trembling hands, Tom approached the counter. "Excuse me, Judge Crawford, but did you say Catherine Whitmore?" The judge looked up from his paper. "Yes, young man. Do you know something about the case?" Could I see that newspaper?" Judge Crawford handed him the Denver Post, and there, on the front page, was a photograph that made Tom's heart stop. It was Catherine, dressed in elegant mourning clothes, standing beside a massive railroad locomotive. The headline read, "Railroad Heiress Continues Search for Missing Husband." The article went on to detail how Harrison Whitmore, 45 years old and worth an estimated $12 million, had vanished without a trace while on a business trip to inspect railroad construction in the Colorado Territory. His private train car had been found abandoned near Glenwood Springs, with no sign of foul play, but also no indication of where he might have gone. His widow has been traveling extensively, the article continued, visiting every town along the railroad routes, hoping to find some clue to her husband's fate. Mrs. Whitmore, the former Catherine Beaumont of Philadelphia society, inherited control of the Whitmore Railroad empire upon her husband's disappearance being declared a presumptive death. Tom couldn't read any more. The woman he'd held in his arms, the woman who had made him feel like he could conquer the world, was not only married, but married to one of the richest, most powerful men in the country. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," Judge Crawford observed. I might have met her once," Tom managed. "Mrs. Whitmore, she stopped in Cedar Ridge a few months back." "Well, if you remember anything that might help solve this mystery, you should contact the authorities. There's a substantial reward being offered for any information leading to Harrison Whitmore's discovery." Tom nodded numbly and left the store, his mind reeling. Everything about that night made sense now. Catherine's expensive clothes, her refined manners, the sadness in her eyes that he'd attributed to loneliness but now understood was grief. She had been searching for her missing husband, and Tom had been nothing more than a brief distraction from her sorrow. But even as his rational mind told him this, his heart refused to believe that their connection had been false. The way she had looked at him, the way she had danced with him, the way her voice had softened when she spoke of her losses, that couldn't have been an act. What do you think Tom should do with this shocking revelation? Should he try to contact Catherine, or respect the vast gulf between their stations in life? Let me know in the comments, because fate is about to make that decision for him. Winter settled over Cedar Ridge with unusual severity, and Tom threw himself into his work, trying and forget what he now knew to be an impossible dream. But in late November, everything changed again. Tom was bringing his flock back from the north pastures when he saw smoke rising from the direction of Widow Peterson's cabin, about 5 miles from town. Mrs. Peterson was a 70-year-old woman who lived alone, and Tom often checked on her during his rounds. When he arrived at the cabin, he found it wasn't on fire as he'd feared, but smoke was pouring from the chimney in an unusual way. He knocked on the door and called out, but received no answer. Tom forced the door open and found Mrs. Peterson collapsed near her stove, unconscious and barely breathing. The cabin was filled with smoke from a block chimney, and she was suffering from smoke inhalation. Working quickly, Tom carried her outside into the fresh air and did what he could to revive her. When she came around, weak but alive, he realized she needed medical attention beyond what the town doctor could provide. "The nearest hospital is in Cheyenne," he told her. "That's a 2-day ride by wagon, but there's a railroad depot 40 miles east that connects to the main line. If I can get you there, we can have you in Denver by tomorrow night." Mrs. Peterson was too weak to argue, and Tom knew time was critical. He loaded her into his small cart and began the dangerous journey across the winter prairie toward the railroad depot at Miller Station. They traveled through the night, Tom pushing his horses as hard as he dared while trying to keep Mrs. Peterson warm and comfortable. By dawn, they reached Miller Station, little more than a water tower, a small depot building, and a loading platform in the middle of nowhere. Tom carried Mrs. Peterson into the depot, where the station agent, a gruff man named Bill Murphy, took one look at the situation and began sending telegrams to arrange for medical care to meet them in Denver. "Next eastbound train comes through at 2 this afternoon," Murphy told Tom. "I've wired ahead. There'll be a doctor waiting at Union Station." Tom spent the morning caring for Mrs. Peterson and trying not to think about the cost of the train tickets, which would take nearly all his savings. But saving a life was worth any sacrifice. At precisely 2 o'clock, the eastbound express pulled into Miller Station with a screech of brakes and a blast of steam. Tom helped Mrs. Peterson aboard, speaking with the conductor about her condition and the arrangements that had been made. He was just helping to settle her into a seat when he heard a voice that made his heart stop. "Tom? Tom McKinnon?" He turned, and there was Catherine, standing in the aisle of the passenger car, dressed in traveling clothes of black silk. She looked thinner than he remembered, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. For a moment, neither of them could speak. Then Catherine stepped forward, her hand reaching out as if to touch him before falling back to her side. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly. Mrs. Peterson here had an accident. Smoke inhalation. I'm taking her to Denver for medical care." Tom's voice sounded strange in his own ears. Catherine looked down at the elderly woman, her expression immediately filling with concern. "Is there anything I could do to help?" Before Tom could answer, the conductor called, "All aboard," and the train began to move. Tom had intended to buy a return ticket on the next westbound train, but in his concern for Mrs. Peterson, he found himself seated across from Catherine as the Wyoming landscape began to roll past the windows. "I read about your husband," Tom said quietly when Mrs. Peterson had fallen asleep and they had some privacy. "I'm sorry for your loss." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Thank you. Tom, about that night in Cedar Ridge. I should have told you." "You don't owe me any explanations," Tom interrupted, though his heart was breaking. "I understand now why you were traveling and why you seemed so sad." "Do you?" Catherine turned to look at him fully. "Do you understand that that night with you was the first time I felt truly alive in months? Do you understand that I've thought about you every day since then?" Tom stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Catherine, you're a wealthy widow, the head of a railroad empire. I'm nobody, a shepherd who can barely read and write." "You're the kindest, most genuine man I've ever met," Catherine replied fiercely. "And if circumstances were different—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Tom heard what she didn't say. If circumstances were different, if she weren't grieving, if he weren't a poor shepherd, if the world weren't divided into such rigid social classes. The rest of the journey to Denver passed in a blur of stolen glances and carefully neutral conversation. When they arrived, Catherine insisted on paying for Mrs. Peterson's medical care, and she made sure the old woman would be looked after until she was well enough to return home. As they stood on the platform at Union Station, surrounded by the bustle and noise of the big city, Catherine took Tom's hand. "I have to return to Philadelphia," she said. "There are business matters that require my attention and other obligations." "I understand. Tom, I want you to know that if I were free to choose my own path, if I could ignore what society expects of me—" She squeezed his hand. You would be my choice." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like a dream, leaving Tom standing alone on the platform with his heart both soaring and breaking at the same time. He had no way of knowing that Catherine's other obligations included pressure from her late husband's business partners to remarry quickly, or that there were secrets about Harrison Whitmore's disappearance that made her situation far more complicated than anyone knew. And he certainly couldn't have imagined that their paths would cross again under circumstances that would force them both to choose between duty and love, between security and passion, between the life they were expected to live and the life they desperately wanted. If you're wondering whether true love can overcome impossible odds, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. YouTube keeps unsubscribing viewers, because Chapter 3 reveals a shocking secret that changes everything about Harrison Whitmore's disappearance. Spring returned to Wyoming Territory in 1888, but Tom McKinnon felt like he was living in perpetual winter. 6 months had passed since that bittersweet encounter with Catherine on the train to Denver, and he had heard nothing from her. He'd seen her name occasionally in newspapers that made their way to Cedar Ridge, always in connection with railroad business or Philadelphia Society events, but she felt as distant as the moon. Tom had taken to spending his earnings on books, teaching himself to read better and learning about the wider world that Catherine inhabited. Old Judge Crawford, noticing the young man's efforts at self-improvement, had lent him law books and newspapers, saying it was never too late for an ambitious man to better himself. It was during one of these reading sessions in the judge's office that Tom's world shifted once again. "Tom, you might find this interesting," Judge Crawford said, handing him a telegram that had just arrived. "There's been a development in the Harrison Whitmore case." Tom's hands trembled as he read the message from the territorial marshal's office. "Body discovered near Glenwood Springs. Stop preliminary identification as Harrison Whitmore. Confirmed stop evidence. Suggests foul play stop. Mrs. Whitmore requested in Colorado for identification stop." "They found him," Tom said quietly. "Indeed. And if it's murder, as the telegram suggests, this changes everything. Mrs. Whitmore won't just be a grieving widow anymore. She'll be the key witness in a murder investigation." 3 days later, Tom was shocked to see Catherine step off the afternoon train in Cedar Ridge. She looked pale and drawn, dressed in deep mourning black, but she carried herself with the same dignified grace he remembered. Tom was leading his sheep back from the creek when he saw her walking toward him across the prairie. Having somehow learned where to find him, his heart leaped at the sight of her, even as his mind raced with questions about why she would come here, of all places. "Tom," she said when she reached him, slightly out of breath from a walk, "I hope you don't mind my coming to find you. I needed to see you." "Of course I don't mind. But, Catherine, what are you doing here? I heard about your husband being found." Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "Yes, they've confirmed it's Harrison. The authorities say he was murdered, Tom. Shot in his body, hidden in an old mine shaft." Tom set down his shepherd's staff and moved closer to her. "I'm so sorry. This must be terrible for you." "That's just it," Catherine said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Tom, I have to tell someone, and I trust you more than anyone else in the world right now." She looked around the empty prairie, making sure they were completely alone. "Harrison and our marriage wasn't what people thought it was. We barely knew each other when we wed. It was arranged by our families for business reasons. He was much older and he had problems, drinking, gambling, and worse." Tom listened in stunned silence as Catherine continued. 6 months before he disappeared, Harrison had gotten involved with some dangerous men, investors in a mining scheme that turned out to be fraudulent. He'd taken money from a railroad company to cover his gambling debts, and when the scheme collapsed, these men threatened him. That's why he went Colorado. He was running, Tom. He'd embezzled nearly $500,000 from his own company, and he was going to disappear rather than face the consequences. He asked me to come with him, but I couldn't. I couldn't live that kind of life. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "The last time I saw him alive, we argued terribly. He said if I wouldn't come with him, he'd disappear anyway and let everyone think he was dead. He said I could inherit the company and be free of him. What do you think about this shocking revelation?" Was Catherine right to refuse to run away with her husband? Let me know in the comments, because what she tells Tom next will change everything. Tom felt a mixture of emotions: pity for Catherine's terrible situation, anger at the man who had put her through such anguish, and a growing understanding of why she had seemed so haunted when they first met. But now they're saying he was murdered. Tom said gently, "Yes, and Tom, the territorial marshal thinks I might have been involved. They're asking questions about my whereabouts during the time Harrison disappeared, about our marriage, about who would benefit from his death." Catherine gripped Tom's hands desperately. "They don't understand that I've been trying to save the railroad company from the financial disaster Harrison created. I've been using my own inheritance from my father to cover the missing money, try to keep thousands of workers employed and investors from losing everything. Surely when you explain the situation, you don't understand how this works, Tom. In their world, a woman who inherits a fortune when her husband dies is automatically suspect, no matter what the circumstances. And if they discover that Harrison was embezzling money, it will destroy not just me, but everyone who depends on the railroad." Tom was beginning to understand the impossible position Catherine found herself in. "What can I do to help?" Catherine looked at him with an expression of such gratitude and love that it took his breath away. "Just let me stay here for a few days. I've told everyone I need time alone to grieve before the investigation continues. I can't face going back to Philadelphia right now, and I wanted to be with the one person who sees me as Catherine, not as Mrs. Harrison Whitmore." Tom didn't hesitate. "You can stay at the old Hendricks cabin. It's been empty since they moved to California. It's simple, but it's clean and private." For the next week, Catherine stayed in the small cabin while Tom continued his work with the sheep. In the evenings, he would bring her supplies, and they would talk for hours about everything except the investigation waiting for her back east. It was during these conversations that Tom saw the real Catherine, not the wealthy railroad heiress, but a woman who had been trapped in a loveless marriage, who had sacrificed her own happiness to try to save her husband's reputation and the livelihoods of thousands of workers. "I never wanted the railroad empire," she told him one evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the cabin's porch. "I wanted to teach school, maybe write books. But when Harrison disappeared, I couldn't let all those people lose their jobs because of his mistakes. You've been carrying this burden alone all this time. Until now. Tom, these past few days with you have been the most peaceful I've known in years. Here, I can just be myself." "Then stay," Tom said impulsively. "Forget about Philadelphia. Forget about the railroad. Stay here with me." Catherine smiled sadly. "You know I can't. There are too many people depending on me, and if I run away now, it will only make me look more guilty. Then I'll come with you. To Philadelphia, to Colorado, wherever you need to go. You shouldn't face this alone. Tom, you don't understand what you're offering. This isn't just about money or social position anymore. If I'm charged with Harrison's murder, then we'll prove you're innocent. Catherine, I love you. I've loved you since that first night we danced in Cedar Ridge. If you'll have me, I'll stand by you no matter what happens." Catherine stared at him in amazement. "You love me? Even knowing about Harrison, about the investigation, about all the complications? Especially knowing all that. You're the strongest, most honorable person I've ever met. You've sacrificed everything to protect people who don't even know what you've done for them." That night, under the vast Wyoming sky, Catherine and Tom made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She would return to face the investigation, but she wouldn't face it alone. Tom would accompany her east, not as a shepherd boy in love with a railroad heiress, but as a man who would stand by the woman he loved no matter what the cost. But neither of them could have anticipated what they would discover in Colorado, evidence that would not only clear Catherine's suspicion, but reveal a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in the territory. And they certainly couldn't have imagined that Tom's simple honesty and sharp mind would be the keys to solving a murder that had baffled professional investigators for months. Stay tuned and make sure you're still subscribed. YouTube has been automatically unsubscribing people, because Chapter 4 reveals a shocking truth about Harrison Whitmore's murder and tests whether love really can conquer all obstacles. 2 weeks later, Tom McKinnon found himself in places he'd never imagined. First in the elegant parlor car of a private train heading to Colorado, then in the opulent offices of the Whitmore Railroad Company in Denver, and finally standing beside Catherine in the territorial courthouse in Glenwood Springs. Tom had sold his flock and used his savings to buy a decent suit, though he knew he still looked out of place among the lawyers, investigators, and business associates who surrounded Catherine. But she had insisted he stay close to her, and Tom was determined to honor that trust. The investigation had taken a dramatic turn when new evidence surfaced about Harrison Whitmore's business dealings. A former associate named Marcus Thornton had come forward with information about the mining scheme that had led to Harrison's embezzlement. Mrs. Whitmore, U.S. Marshal James Crawford, no relation to the judge in Cedar Ridge, addressed Catherine as they sat in the courthouse conference room. Mr. Thornton's testimony corroborates your account of your husband's financial difficulties. However, we still need to establish a clear timeline of events. Catherine, dressed in simple black traveling clothes, maintained her composure as she had throughout the ordeal. Tom sat beside her, offering silent support. According to our investigation, the marshal continued, your husband left Philadelphia on March 15, 1887, claiming to be inspecting railroad construction in Colorado. But we now know he was actually meeting with certain individuals about hiding the embezzled funds. Who were these individuals? Tom asked, surprising everyone with his directness. The marshal looked at him with curiosity. And you are Thomas McKinnon. I'm Mrs. Whitmore's friend and advisor. Catherine squeezed Tom's hand gratefully under the table. Well, Mr. McKinnon, that's where this case becomes interesting. We've identified 3 men who were involved in pressuring Harrison Whitmore, Vincent Reese, owner of the Continental Mining Company, Samuel Morrison, a banker from San Francisco, and Edmund Blake, who was supposed to be Whitmore's business partner. The marshal spread photographs on the table. All 3 men were in Colorado at the time of Whitmore's disappearance. All 3 had motive to kill him, either to prevent him from exposing their fraudulent mining scheme or to silence him permanently. Tom studied the photographs carefully. Something about one of the men looked familiar, but he couldn't place where he might have seen him. Marshal, Tom said slowly, could you tell me more about this Edmund Blake? Interesting fellow. Claimed to be from Denver, but we've discovered he was actually using a false identity. His real name is Edgar Bramwell, and he's wanted in 3 states for various confidence schemes. Suddenly, Tom's memory clicked into place. Catherine, do you remember that first night we met in Cedar Ridge? There was a man at the hotel who seemed to be watching you. Catherine frowned. I remember feeling like someone was observing me, but I thought it was just because I was a stranger in town. Tom turned to the marshal. What did this Blake, or Bramwell, look like? About 50 years old, well-dressed, with graying hair and a small scar on his left cheek. Marshal Crawford's eyebrows shot up. That's an exact description. How could you possibly know that? Because I saw him in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, on the same night Mrs. Whitmore was there. He was asking questions about her at the hotel. What do you think this revelation means for the investigation? Could Tom's observation be the key to solving Harrison Whitmore's murder? Let me know in the comments, because this breakthrough is about to change everything. The marshal immediately began taking detailed notes about Tom's recollection. Mr. McKinnon, this could be crucial evidence. If Blake was following Mrs. Whitmore, it suggests he was already planning something. Over the next few days, the investigation moved quickly. Tom's testimony helped establish that Edgar Bramwell had been tracking Catherine's movements, probably hoping to use her to get at Harrison or to the embezzled money. The breakthrough came when a railroad worker in Glenwood Springs remembered seeing Bramwell arguing with a well-dressed man near the old mine shaft where Harrison's body was found. The worker heard gunshots, Marshal Crawford explained to Catherine and Tom. When he investigated, he saw Bramwell dragging something into the mine shaft, but he was too frightened to report it at the time. So Harrison was murdered by this Bramwell character, not by Catherine. Tom said with relief, That's correct. We believe Bramwell killed Harrison when he refused to reveal where he'd hidden the embezzled money. What Bramwell didn't know was that Harrison had already returned most of the money to the railroad account before he left Philadelphia. Catherine gasped. He returned the money? Yes, ma'am. Our investigation of the company books shows that Harrison deposited nearly $400,000 back into the company accounts just before he left. It appears he was trying to make amends. For the first time since the investigation began, Catherine broke down in tears, not grief, but of relief. He was trying to do the right thing in the end. With Catherine cleared of all suspicion and Bramwell captured in Nevada on other charges, they were finally free to return to their lives. But as they stood outside the courthouse in the spring sunshine, both realized that everything had changed. "Tom," Catherine said quietly, "I need to return to Philadelphia to settle Harrison's affairs and reorganize the railroad company. It could take months, maybe years." Tom's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt. "I understand," he said. "You have responsibilities, a life back east that I could never be part of." "That's where you're wrong," Catherine said, turning to face him fully. "Tom McKinnon, you've shown me what real courage looks like. You left everything you knew to stand by me when I needed you most. You helped solve a murder that professional investigators couldn't crack. Do you really think I care more about social conventions than I do about the man I love?" Tom stared at her in amazement. "Catherine, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you'll have me, I want to marry you. Not because I need protection or security, but because I can't imagine living without you. But the railroad empire, your social position, can all be managed by capable people while we build a life together. Tom, I've learned something these past months. Money and social position mean nothing if you don't have someone to share them with who truly knows and loves you." Tom swept Catherine into his arms, right there in front of the courthouse, not caring who saw them. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because once I marry you, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm never letting you go." "I'm counting on it, Mr. McKinnon." 6 months later, Thomas McKinnon and Catherine Whitmore were married in a simple ceremony in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming. Judge Crawford performed the ceremony. An entire town turned out to celebrate the shepherd boy who had won the heart of a railroad heiress. Catherine sold the majority of her railroad interests to her business partners, keeping enough to ensure the company's stability and worker security. With the proceeds, she and Tom bought a large ranch in Wyoming, where they raised cattle, horses, and eventually 3 children who grew up understanding that love, not money, was the true measure of wealth. Tom continued to educate himself and eventually became a territorial judge himself, known throughout Wyoming for his fairness and wisdom. Catherine established schools throughout the territory, finally fulfilling her dream of helping others learn and grow. The old-timers in Cedar Ridge still tell the story of the shepherd boy who danced with a lady from the train and discovered that true love really can overcome any obstacle, social class, family expectations, and even murder investigations. And every year on Founders Day, when the town gathers for music and dancing, you can still see Tom and Catherine McKinnon waltzing together in the town square, proving that some love stories really do have fairy tale endings. What did you think of this incredible love story? Did Tom and Catherine's romance remind you that true love conquers all? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story touched your heart. And please, make sure you're still subscribed to our channel. YouTube has been automatically unsubscribing people without warning. We bring you amazing historical love stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss a single one. What love stories have inspired you in your own life? Sometimes the greatest romances happen between the most unlikely people, in the most unexpected places. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next incredible tale of love that defies all odds.